Well, thank you very much. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. Well, it is truly a privilege to be here. I have never been here before and have really looked forward to this. I was supposed to be here last year, and I had an accident. And I'm recovering still nicely, and the Lord has blessed me. But as George Burns used to say, I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to be anywhere. And so it is really something I've anticipated, and I want to thank Dwight for the invitation. This is the first time I've met him, first time I've been to Green Bay. And I want to also thank my hosts last night, the Danielsons, who are terrific hosts. And, you know, when I came in, when I fly, I do know where I'm going. But I'd never been to Green Bay, so I didn't know where anything was. And I knew about the Packers, but, I thought maybe it's like Dallas or Indianapolis. The stadium's just in the middle of, rush hour. And so when we were coordinating about dinner, I told Mary, I said, just something simple is fine. I'm the kind of person, if you just throw me a ham sandwich, I'm good. And so I just thought we're going to do something, we'll go to Dairy Queen or whatever. And so they picked me up from the airport, and we drive a little while, and we turn onto this wide avenue, and all of a sudden Lambeau Field's in front of me. So as a football fan and as a person who loves history, they were taking me the holy grail of football. And we went to the 1919 restaurant, and I can assure you I will come back time and again for the cheese bisque. Really, really an interesting place to be. So this has been fabulous so far. And so my topic for this afternoon is Israel, a different perspective. And what I want to do, is that working okay?
Having a little bit of flickering and stuff there.
I may have to go old school. Okay. All right. We'll see if this works. But I have advocated for Israel in one way or another for over 20 years. And, as a pro-Israel Christian and as a person who obviously understands the specialness of the Jewish people from Scripture, there were times early on when I'd get pretty anxious about current events and things going on. And slowly over time, my perception changed about that, because I have a conviction now that if we are, if we're Bible people, honestly, should we really worry about Israel? The Jewish people are eternal. The Lord has worked in astonishing ways in the modern world for the Jewish state. And so my perspective has changed a lot. Now, obviously there are challenges to Israel, and I'm going to talk about some of those today, but I'm also going to talk about positive things, okay? My first change in perspective came in 1999. I was talking with an Israeli friend who had been chief of staff for a couple of prime ministers, including Ben-Gurion. And this was the year that Netanyahu was being challenged in his first term by Ehud Barak. Now, I think everybody in the building here loves Bibi Netanyahu. He's a great leader, a man for the moment. But then he was less. He wasn't as strong as a politician in building his base, and so Barak, who had served with him in the IDF, mounted a challenge to him. And so I was talking to my friend one day in a few months before they called early elections, and I'm all anxious about everything, because in my head, if Netanyahu doesn't win, then something's off. This is not good. And he listened to me for a while, and he was a real calm guy. And finally he said, Jim, he said, look, it doesn't matter about an election. He said, "Stop worrying about who's going to win the election. Do you know what really matters?" And I said, "No, what?" I thought he was going to tell me something, political. He said, "The Messiah is coming." And that really began to change my thinking about how I look at Israel and what's going on with them. And then a couple of years ago, I became acquainted with a great group in New York, the America-Israel Friendship League. And they reached out to me and wanted me to do a church outreach program whereby we go into churches and do seminars on everything from the Holocaust to current issues. And I really began to enjoy these people. And they exist to build relationships for Israel, particularly strengthening ties between the United States and Israel. They do a lot of things like student exchange programs. And so the more I looked at what they did, the more impressed I was. And they also had an aspect to their program that really appealed to me, and that is they like to emphasize some positive things. Again, as a Christian Zionist who supports Israel, I know in our community too often we can get kind of bogged down in the negative stuff. And so I became involved with them, and I've got some information at my table. So stop and look at that, sign up for our newsletter, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. But the takeaway today is to acknowledge the reality of where we are, and we all certainly know where we are in the world. I mean, the world is crazier than it's been in my lifetime, and I think everybody in the room would agree. And yet, if we are Bible people, we should have a different perspective. And that includes how we look at predictive prophecy. So, I want to look at some challenges and then look at some other perspectives about Israel. And hopefully, you'll come to see, as I do, that, well, as I like to say anymore, I don't really worry about Israel. I do worry about everybody else. In the issue with Iran threatening to exterminate Israel and wipe it off the map, it's not Israel that's in trouble, if Scripture can be believed. Iran, however, is in a great deal of trouble. So let's look at it in that light. One of the challenges is that the Russians a couple of years ago became involved in Syria. The civil war in Syria gave the Russians their first real opportunity ever to establish an actual on-the-ground base in the Mediterranean. And this is problematic for many reasons. 2 years ago, they put 2 fighter squadrons in northern Syria. This has caused the Israelis to have to coordinate with them so that everybody understands whose airspace they're in. And Netanyahu has met with Putin 6 times to talk about these issues. And so far, there haven't been any mishaps, but it's a real concern. In Lebanon, there are 60,000 Iranians now in Lebanon. They are helping Hezbollah rearm and arm themselves to the teeth. There are tens of thousands of rockets that are secreted away in 200 Lebanese villages in the south, all aimed at Israel. So there are real challenges with regard to the northern border, obviously the southern border with Hamas. ISIS is making some noise in the region. There's also, of course, the aforementioned Iranians. The Iranians want a military base in Damascus, and they also want a seaport in Tartus, Syria, just off the coast. Those are 2 things that cannot happen. The Israelis, I believe, would never allow it, but yet it's an issue that has to be dealt with all the time. But when we look back, we can rightly say, what's new? The Israelis have been challenged for the last 70 years. The Jews in Palestine were challenged for 50 years before statehood. There has never been a time when their neighbors would accept the existence of a Jewish state. And yet, and this is one of my favorite photos, time and time and time again, God has intervened for the Jewish people, for Israel, in ways that you cannot explain away any other way. Secular answers don't hold water. And if you know the region and know the history and know what Israel has faced and overcome, and you don't believe in supernatural intervention, then you don't want to believe in it. You're making a choice not to believe in God. This is a picture of Mordecai Gur, the colonel who led the 66th Paratroop Brigade in Jerusalem on June 7th, 1967, the Six-Day War. He is sitting on the Mount of Olives. He's getting a radio transmission. The government has finally given them the green light to capture the old city. And they did that later in the morning. First time the Jews had been sovereign in Jerusalem in 2,000 years, since the time of the Maccabees. This summer I was there, and it just so happened I'd gone for another reason, but it occurred to me as I was planning my trip that I would be, we're flickering again. It occurred to me that I would be there at the same time the IDF had liberated Jerusalem. And so that morning, at the exact moment that the IDF had entered Lions Gate 50 years before, I walked through the gate, and the hair stood up on the back of my neck. And you can't experience things like that, and you can't understand the sovereignty of God and not understand that all of Scripture is true. I mean, what did he say in Jeremiah? He said, I have loved you with an everlasting love. That was meant for the Jewish people. He did not say that to a Presbyterian church in Peoria. Later in that chapter, he said, so long as the sun and the moon give their light, I will not forget my people. And so he does not, nor will he ever forget them. The Jewish people are eternal. But there are challenges, and one of the challenges that they face is a subject that's really become very interesting to me in the last 5 or 6 years. I've spent a lot of time researching this. And that is the erosion of support for Israel among American Christians. Ministries, major churches, other organizations. It's a phenomenon that seems like it's come on us quickly, but I think the seeds of it were sown a long time ago. I call them ironic enemies because they are professing Christians or claim to be a part of the Christian community, and yet they work tirelessly day and night to undermine Israel in myriad ways. Okay? There is a multi-pronged attack against the Jewish state on many, many levels. It's almost dizzying. This is John Shelby Spong, of course, now retired Episcopal Bishop of New Jersey. Spong has spent his career undermining the Bible, or trying to. And I find it very ironic that he touts his fight against anti-Semitism pretty often. But it should seem obvious that if you deny Jewish history, as he does by relegating the Hebrew Scriptures to myth, you're nothing but a rank anti-Semite. Only an anti-Semite would undermine Jewish history in the Bible. But that's what Spong does. But it's not just in the main line. In fact, the main line used to be the problem. The main line and some Catholic sources. Now, this fight has come right into the evangelical camp. Straight into the heart of it. Because if you were on the other side, what would you do? What would your target be? The people you've already targeted and won over? No. It would be the biggest prize of all, the evangelical community in America. So on the left, here is a photo of Cameron Strang, the publisher of Relevant Magazine. Pentecostal charismatic roots. His father publishes Charisma Magazine. Here he is excitedly posing with the scholar N.T. Wright, British Bible scholar, who, by the way, I call him N.T. wrong, because if he's talking about Israel, he's wrong. Spiritualizing the Jews out of Scripture doesn't make you a scholar. But Cameron Strang is very pleased to be with him. About a dozen years ago in Relevant, he published an article that was pro-Israel. I mean, those were his roots. But after that, he began going to a place he calls Israel-Palestine with Lynn Hybels and other evangelical leaders, and he turned completely to the hard left. Hard left. So today, when they do talk about Israel in the pages of Relevant, or one of their favorite things to mock, Bible prophecy, it's very much from a leftist perspective. They have published some of the most outrageous propaganda against Israel in support of the Palestinians you'll ever read, right in the middle of the evangelical community. Then, of course, on the right, Shane Claiborne. Shane sort of projects this image of a thoughtful hippie that's just strumming his guitar and loves everybody. But he's very anti-Israel. And I'll tell you a quick story about him that illustrates what I'm talking about, that further illustrates this challenge that we have as pro-Israel Christians. A few years ago, he wrote a book with Tony Campolo, his anti-Israel mentor, called Red Letter Revolution. And in the book, they had an interesting format. They would take different subjects for each chapter, and they would have a dialogue, and then one of them would answer whatever question the other posed. So, as I inevitably knew they would do, they got around to the Arab-Israeli conflict. And so in this particular chapter, Campolo asks the question and Shane answers so that they could present Israel in the most negative light possible. Because, one of the things they always say is the occupation, of course, is the cause of the crisis in the Middle East. It's the oppression that Israel, they oppress the Palestinians, okay? And so he gives this anecdote that was very weird. And he said that, it's like they're dialoguing. And he said, in Israel, there are 3 bodyguards for every person there. Every Israeli in the country. And I thought, 3 bodyguards? Because, the numbers don't add up. I mean, in a country of 7 million people, well, even if you just take the 500,000 or so Jews that are in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, I mean, you're talking about upwards of maybe 1 million bodyguards in a country of 7 million people. I mean, think that through. That means that a good number of them have to be toddlers and elderly grandmothers, because where are you going to come up with 1 million? So he wants to present the scenario that the Israelis are just roving bands of vigilantes that fan out and protect their own people, but at the expense of the Palestinians. And so I had an opportunity to talk to him on the phone about this, about his book. So I asked him, I said, that's an interesting statistic, the 3 bodyguards for every Israeli. I said, where did you hear that? And I told him the thing about, wow, that's a lot of bodyguards in a tiny country. And his answer was, well, somebody just told me that. Somebody just told you that. You're denigrating a whole people. You're demonizing Israel. You're engaging in propaganda that demonizes the Jewish people, and somebody just told you that? So I wrote to the publisher, Thomas Nelson, more than once, and they don't care. And by the way, this is another subject for another time. Mainstream Christian publishing today is not interested in the truth. Straight up. So the publishers didn't care to correct an egregious error in the book. He didn't care because it made the point he wanted to make. Pictured on the left is a former pastor of a church in North Carolina, in Charlotte, Jonathan Martin. He is seated with Stephen Seitzer and Porter Speakman Jr. at Martin's church several years ago. This was when 2010 when the film With God on Our Side came out, which is an anti-Israel, pro-Palestinian propaganda piece. Seitzer in the middle, I think, I'm giving you my opinion, has the distinction of being the most prominent Jew hater in the Christian world. Speakman was the producer of the film. What was Jonathan Martin doing promoting Palestinian propaganda in an American church? And if you think that's an anomaly, you better think again. This is becoming common. Look at the picture on the right. This is Baptist pastor Bob Roberts Jr. fawning over Mohammed Morsi when that dictator took brief control of Egypt a few years ago. He met him in New York. And he's proud of this photo. Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood, which wants to exterminate Israel and the United States and establish Sharia. It's incredible. Evangelical leadership in this country is virtually gone. I was born and raised in the Southern Baptist Church. The same thing is happening there. This is Russell Moore, who is president of the SBC's Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, which is oddly a sort of political lobbying group for a denomination with offices in Nashville and Washington. Russell Moore is not pro-Israel. And he is not an anomaly anymore in that denomination. Here he's talking about a trip that he took to Bethlehem Bible College, which is a hotbed of anti-Israel propaganda put out by the PLO. And Moore is talking about visiting his friends there at Bethlehem Bible College. A pro-Israel friend of mine who lives there was there. And his reply to me was, he's not with us on this issue, meaning supporting Israel. This kind of stuff is going to get worse. Danny Aiken, who is the president of Southeastern Seminary, Southern Baptist Seminary, affirmed a tweet a couple of weeks ago. He said, "Good word and reminder, thank you." The tweet says, "White Christians should remember they worship a brown-skinned, Aramaic-speaking Palestinian man seated at the right hand of the Father." Well, a seminary president who's educating next generation pastors thinks Jesus was Palestinian? Are you kidding? Jesus was never a Palestinian. He was and is and will always be a Jew. Astonishing that evangelical leadership is engaging in this kind of propaganda. They're pandering, in my opinion, to minorities because they know they're losing market share. I mean, people are exiting their churches. There's an exodus from Christian churches today because they're not being taught the Bible. So the only way they know to fill it, because they're not going to jettison their church growth techniques, is to pander to minorities and disaffected groups, including those who affirm the Palestinian narrative. Here's a photo on the left of Seitzer with Lynn Hybels of Willow Creek. She and her husband started Willow Creek Church in Chicago 40 years ago. I would argue that the Willow Creek Association is the most influential organization within evangelicalism today, worldwide. The trifecta of Rick Warren on the West Coast, the Hybels in Chicago, and Andy Stanley on the East Coast dominate evangelicalism in this country. Whatever they're promoting is what the people in the pews are going to hear. Seitzer is a straight-up anti-Semite. On the right is the popular author Ann Voskamp. And I don't want to be unkind, but if you can make heads or tails of most of the things that she writes, I'll give you a $100 bill. I don't understand what she's saying. It's supposed to be deep and wise. Here she's at the Sea of Galilee reflecting. Very reflective photo that can be used in building your brand. She was there with Lynn Hybels getting the picture in a place I call Israel-Palestine. I don't know where Palestine is. Do you? I haven't seen it on any atlas. There's no embassy in Washington. If you put it into a GPS, you'd run out of gas before you ever got there. Where is Israel-Palestine? Evangelical leaders in this country should be ashamed of themselves for using a politically loaded term invented by the PLO. The PLO. You know who first started the Jesus was Palestinian nonsense? Yasser Arafat. Now you've got a Southern Baptist seminary president parroting the same thing. But let me turn my attention now to more positive things. I mentioned earlier the America-Israel Friendship League, AIFL.org. Go to the website and check out what they're doing. Also sign up for our newsletter. They're doing some interesting things, and they're very well connected. They're very aware of the realities, obviously, in Israel. They are staunch Israel supporters, but again, they present some information that you won't hear other places, where other places are going to talk about all the negative stuff and that kind of thing. There are good things going on. Maybe not as many as we like, but there are good things going on. Now, this is Joel Klein, who just assumed the presidency of the AIFL, a terrific guy, great staff up there, and I'm really glad to be associated with them. One of the things that they do is, if you sign up, every week they send what they call Top 10 Secrets About Israel. And notice my clever title, Power of Positive Thinking, because we all love and revere Dr. Schuller. This is a different kind of positive thinking. This is a better way to think about the Arab-Israeli conflict. And so, they'll send things like technological advances in Israel, or what is going on with the economy, or medical advances, or things like that. It's really, for a person who, I consider that I have a pretty good knowledge of the region, I use the information myself. And it's really good to use, especially with millennials. If you have millennial grandchildren or children that are in college, share some of this information with them. It really is eye-opening. It does change minds when they see that Israel is not what is presented on CNN and MSNBC. Now, in moving towards some I want to look at some examples right now of things that have made an impact on me, seeing them and then thinking it through in light of Scripture. And always with the idea in my mind that reality is often quite different than what the world paints it. Again, even when it comes to what we consider to be the peril that Israel is in. I'm going to tell you again, as Christians who believe the Bible and who support Israel, we should stop wringing our hands about whether Israel will continue to exist or not. Israel is not going anywhere. When I was there this summer, I was walking around the old city in Jerusalem with my friend Brian Schrager, and we saw the neatest thing that really spoke to me like a symbol of how God protects His people always. And we know that the Holocaust occurred, and there have been terrible things and pogroms, and the Jews have been hunted and harassed for 4,000 years, but they're still here. See? And so we were walking around, and literally across the street from the Temple Mount, Brian pointed out these ruins that have been excavated by Israeli archaeologists, and on the left is the site, the famous site of Accra. Now, some of you who know history remember the Greek ruler Antiochus Epiphanes. 2nd century BC, another Jew hater, another totalitarian, another Hitler who was going to get rid of the Jews. Well, he did what he could, but the Maccabees ended up defeating his army in establishing sovereignty. And as a final insult, Antiochus developed a disease that was most unpleasant and nasty, and it lingered And he died a horrible death. And it gave him a lot of time to take stock of things he had done. And so he had built this fortress, Acre, outside Jerusalem to lay siege to it and then to establish his little empire there for however long it would be. Well, they discovered Acre under a parking lot. And the Temple Mount is still there. The Israeli flag flies over the city. The Jewish people are still here. The Jewish people are eternal. Israel is here to stay. Another totalitarian thug built a fortress that was found under a parking lot. On the right is a plaque dedicated to Modagur, the commander of the paratroop brigade that liberated Jerusalem in 1967. It's right outside Lionsgate, and the Arabs have to pass it every day on their way into the city. It commemorates him and the men he led in an action that I consider to be supernatural. He has loved them with an everlasting love. On the way to the Dead Sea, if you ever go there, you're driving down the highway, and once you get just south of Jerusalem into the Judean hills, the Judean hills are like a moonscape. It's one of the most barren places you'll ever see. It's just these hills with no vegetation. It's all desert. The Dead Sea's there. And yet, the Israelis, through ingenuity, are reclaiming even the parched desert. Because what did the prophets say? They said over and over and over again that at a time the Lord had appointed, He would bring His people back, where they would remain forever, I might add, and they would reclaim the land. There are palm groves at the Dead Sea. Palm groves in the middle of the desert. The day will come when the whole place will be green, just like it is in the Galilee in the north. Israeli ingenuity driven by the Lord of the universe. And if you think otherwise, then you're not paying attention. The Israeli economy is, we all know this, but just a couple of little things that are amazing. It's in the top 20 globally. For a country that small, it's astonishing what they accomplish economically. Their GDP this year will be $339 billion. And they bring in more than 3.5 million tourists annually. When I was there in June, I went to Sheba Medical Center in Tel Aviv. Mind-blowing facility. A 150-acre campus with the most advanced medical technology on the face of the earth. And for all the people that say the Israelis oppress the Palestinians, I say you're a liar. You're a liar who will be judged for bearing false witness. I met this little boy in an elevator with his father. He was there to get life-saving treatment. He is a Palestinian from Gaza. This precious, precious little boy will grow up seeing the Jews in a different light. The Israelis help people just because that's what they do. And this little boy will have a chance at life that he otherwise wouldn't have. I mean, good grief, Saeed Barakat of the PLO is looking for life-saving treatment in Israeli hospitals. So do members of Hamas. But the Israelis are slowly changing some minds on the other side. They're looking at next generation and next generation. They're accomplishing things at Sheba that my mind could never conceive on its own. I wanted to visit a wounded IDF soldier. And so I thought I was going to go into, like a cafeteria and talk to a guy who had lost a leg. But they took me up to the 3rd floor, and I couldn't go into his room because his injuries are too severe. So I talked to his mother in the hallway. And her son, 3 years ago, took part in the action in Gaza when they had to go in and clear out Hamas to stop the rockets. And her son was a medic in the IDF. And they were going house to house looking for terrorists. Now, why do the Israelis go house to house when they're in Jenin or Nablus or Gaza City? They could flatten the place from the air. They do it because they're humane. They're humane in a neighborhood of beasts. This woman's son was the last member of his unit in the door of this house. And right behind him, a Hamas rocket landed in the courtyard. Shrapnel hit him in the head. He shouldn't be here. And the quality of his life will never be what it once was. But his mother fought for him and continues to fight for him. And his people at Sheba fight for him because they're humanitarians. They're not oppressing anyone. The Jews are all about life, and their enemies are all about death. Now, one of my favorite subjects, and I'll try to run through these fairly quick. When you look at the provision that God has had for His people, not just for 70 years, but for 4,000 years, okay, this isn't recent. This is from the ancient past to now, forward into the future, for the duration. When Israel gets in a literal fight with her enemies, she wins. Now look, you can explain some things away, but if you want to explain Israel's war record away, I'm going to laugh in your face. You can't do it. This again is why I say change your perspective about the danger that Israel is in. From a human standpoint, Israel is in peril. Israel is in existential threat. But that's only if you don't understand that there is a being who watches over them and protects them and preserves them. So I'm going to go through 2 or 3 of my favorite modern stories. This one is my favorite. This is my favorite story of all time. I call it a modern Bible story. It's like it should have been in the book of Joshua. A lot of you remember the Entebbe hostage rescue in the 70s. The PLO had hijacked a plane in Greece. They flew it all the way to the middle of Africa, to Uganda, because they didn't want anybody interfering with them making their political demands, and they threatened to kill everybody on board if the demands weren't met. They wanted some prisoners released from prisons in Europe and Israel. And they let everybody go except 105 Jewish passengers. So, while the world wrings its hands and is afraid and dithers and is indecisive, nobody would help the Israelis. The Israelis decided behind the scenes, because they said they would negotiate publicly. So behind the scenes, in the space of 2.5 days, they planned and executed a hostage rescue that you can't explain apart from the provision of God. Please try. I read the book about this. I put the book down and I thought, did that really happen? So they sent 200 of their best commandos. They sent their whole fleet of transport planes, 4 transport planes, their entire fleet, with no fighter escort, because they didn't want anybody to detect that they were on their way. They flew in the middle of the night, 8 hours, to the middle of Africa. At midnight on July 4th in 1976, they were circling Lake Victoria next to the airport at Entebbe. They touched down at midnight exactly. And do you know that from the time the wheels of the first plane touched down to the time they rescued the hostages with minimal casualties took 5 minutes? 5 minutes. About 10 years ago, I had a chance to talk to two of the guys that went. And one of them, a member of the elite commando unit, the Syriat Matkal, General Staff Reconnaissance Unit, or the unit. The same one that all three Netanyahu brothers were members of. This one was led by the oldest brother, Jonathan. So I talked to these two guys, and one of them is Surin Hershko, who lives in Tel Aviv, and he was one of the few Israeli soldiers injured that night. He was wounded. He was shot in the neck, and for 40 years he's been a quadriplegic. So I visited him in his home. I've never served in the military. And so I said at one point, "Why did you do it?" He was 21 years old. It was an all-volunteer force. I said, "Why did you go?" And he looked at me like coals burning in his eyes. And he said the people were in danger. And he said I would go again. And then he said something I'll never forget. He looked at me and he said, "I still know what it feels like to be a soldier." I believe these men were every bit led by God as much as Joshua was. I spoke to the other fellow, and I wanted to talk to him in particular because he was the first guy in the doorway in the airport terminal where they were keeping the hostages. They kept them all in one large room. Middle of the night, nobody knows they're coming. And he told me, he said, "You know, Jim, if we hadn't had the element of surprise, it would have all blown up in our faces. It would have been a disaster." He said 100 things had to go right that night, but the biggest one was we had to have the element of surprise. If they knew we were coming, they would have just turned around and killed all the hostages. They had machine guns and grenades. So the Israelis fooled them, and they thought they were coming in as commercial airliners. 170 Golani Brigade commandos and the 30 members of the unit. And the unit was the spearhead. So this guy was handpicked by Jonathan Netanyahu to be the first one in the door. And he said, "You know, I had 5 kilos of explosives on my back. I had a megaphone and my weapon. I mean, I can't walk and chew gum at the same time." Can you imagine the enormity of the task? They even knew that the national mood hung in the balance. I mean, if the Israelis could be threatened like this and were, if they were ineffective in rescuing their own people, then it would open up all kinds of terrorism against them. These guys knew what was at stake. So he said he ran toward the door as hard as he could when they got out of their vehicles. And he said they didn't know if the door would be open or closed. That's why he had the explosives. They might have to blow the door open. But he said the door was open. And he said, "Do you know they didn't have any idea what was happening until I was in the doorway?" And he said that the German terrorists, there were a couple of German terrorists with the PLO that night. And this one guy was laying on the floor with an AK-47. And Amir said, he saw me a split second before I saw him, and he fired first, and he said, I could feel bullets and glass go past my face and neck, and nothing hit me. And he dispatched this guy with a quick burst. And he said, another guy came in directly behind me. I turned right, he turned left. We fired 60 rounds in 15 seconds in that room, and it was all over. In the dark, they killed every terrorist. They immediately began loading the hostages onto the planes, flew them back to Israel, again with no fighter escort. 8 hours unprotected. They flew just off the surface of the Red Sea so they wouldn't alert Saudi and Egyptian radar. Landed in Israel. And Jonathan Netanyahu was the only Israeli soldier killed that night. You can't explain that level of effectiveness apart from the Almighty. So, I don't believe Israel is in imminent danger ever. In 1967, the Six-Day War, the Egyptians had massed troops on the border in the Sinai. Remember, they had the Sinai then. They were just on the other side of Israel proper. And General Nasser, another totalitarian nut job who said he was going to wipe Israel off the map. Did these guys never learn? Do they not read history? In the book of Esther, the guys who said they were going to exterminate all the Jews in the kingdom ended up swinging from the end of a rope. 12 years into his 1,000-year Reich, Hitler blew his brains out on a couch in his bunker because the Russians were coming down the street. Did they not learn from history? The UN, of course, was useless. They dithered. So the Israelis, facing an existential threat, Syria, Jordan, Iraq, Lebanon, Egypt, literally surrounded, bordered by the Mediterranean, they were completely encircled. But as they do, the Israelis had been working on contingency plans for a long time, and the chief of the Air Force, Ezra Weitzman, had been working on a plan for about 10 years that they codenamed Focus. And the entire point of Focus was they wanted to reduce the turnaround time that Israeli pilots needed to return to base, be rearmed, refueled, and get back in the air. They knew that geographically it's such a small area that literally every second counts. And so they worked on this for years, practicing to shave the turnaround time off their best mark. Now, the Egyptians weren't stupid. They were doing the same thing. The Soviet-backed Egyptian Air Force, with all kinds of Soviet advisors and MiG fighters and all this stuff. They were working on the same plan. And the Egyptians reduced their turnaround time to 8 hours. They could do all of this, fly a bombing run, come back, do all this, get back in the air in a few hours. You know what the Israelis reduced their turnaround time to? 8 minutes. 8 minutes? So in the morning of June 5th, they decided to launch a preemptive strike. So just after dawn, they sent up virtually their entire Air Force. They went for it. You know, in baseball terms, they swung for the fence as hard as they could because they can't afford to lose. Everybody else can afford to lose a war. We could afford to lose a war. They can't. So they sent up their fighters and bombers, and they turned out toward the Mediterranean. They turned to the west as if they were on another training exercise, which they'd been doing for weeks, and the Egyptians had been watching them for weeks go over the Mediterranean, fly their stuff, and then return to base, and they went back to eating breakfast or sleep or whatever they were doing. So they started that same path that morning, and then all of a sudden they turned sharply back to the east. And within minutes, they were over the Egyptian airfields, which the planes were all exposed on the ground. They destroyed half of Egypt's Air Force in 30 minutes. I mean, the war was effectively over. They had air superiority in the Middle East within hours. Please explain that to me apart from the supernatural. There are positive things going on. We should not worry about Israel in the way we have always worried about them. We should worry about everybody else and ourselves. Israel is fine, has been fine, and will be fine. That's why it's called the 6-Day War. Probably the most miraculous modern war in history. They shouldn't have won it, but they did, and when they did, they captured all of their ancestral land, including the heartland of the country, the mountains of Israel, what the world calls the West Bank. And today 500,000 Jews are settled in the same places their ancestors lived. Please explain that in secular terms. In 1973, the Yom Kippur War. This time Israel was caught flat-footed. The Egyptians and Syrians did it again. And this time, they knocked Israel off their feet for about 24 hours. Moshe Dayan was a defense minister, and he went to Golda Meir, the prime minister, and he said, "Mrs. Prime Minister, I think we need to think about using nukes." And she was incredulous, and he said, "It's that serious." So they managed to hang on for a couple of weeks, but the war was still very much in doubt. You see, the Egyptians and the Syrians wanted to link up in Tel Aviv and cut the country in two. And it would be a war of extermination. So, shockingly, the UN dithered, did nothing. Even the great powers really didn't do anything. So the Israelis once again were on their own, as they will be in the future, we know. One final time. But Ariel Sharon, who was a tank commander, general, had retired from the army in the spring. He'd gone to a sheep ranch in the Negev desert. He was called up for duty like everybody else that could walk. And finally, after just bugging his commanders until they listened to him, he said, "I have a plan." They listened to him and they said, "Okay, go ahead." So he got Israeli IDF engineers down to the Suez Canal, and in the middle of the night they built a pontoon bridge. And they poured tanks and men over it all night long. And the next morning, there was like a heavy fog in the area, and the Egyptians couldn't see anything. It was their Third Army, the vaunted Third Army. When the fog lifted, they saw up on the heights they were surrounded by the IDF. So Sharon radioed back, and he said, "I've encircled Third Army, and I'm going to kill it." Well, then everybody was interested in a ceasefire. So that's what they did. Israel survived in one miraculous fashion. I would argue once again, to repeat myself again, to beat a dead horse. Israel is not in danger in the way we think of danger. A few years ago, I was walking through an archaeological park in Jerusalem, the old city. Came across this really cool old stone arch that's from the time of the Roman siege, when they destroyed Jerusalem and started the worldwide dispersion of the Jewish people. I'm walking along, and I got to this point, and I just stopped in my tracks. The flag flying in the background was lined up in the middle of this arch. It's the Israeli flag. The world thought they were dead. The Lord decided otherwise. The Jewish people are eternal. Israel is here to stay. Remember the great verse from Amos chapter 9. Amos chapter 9 is reality, and it's history right now. It's not, it's not like some of these guys like Spong want to rewrite history and erase history and make it symbolic and all this kind of stuff, or make it about the church. Isn't that sad that they want to make so much of the Old Testament about the church? Please. But in Amos, the Lord says at the time that He decides He will bring His people back, and they will live in their ancient homeland forever, and they will never be uprooted again. If we can't believe that that is literal truth, then we shouldn't waste time in church. 5 years ago, I was there for a conference, and as I always do, if you go to Israel, don't spend your time sleeping. I sleep very little. I wake up early, and one morning I was on my balcony at the hotel drinking coffee when the sun came up. And the sun came up to shine on a Jewish community on the outskirts of Jerusalem. And I realized that I was seeing prophecy fulfilled right in front of my face. There are thousands of Jewish homes in which millions of Jews live in the land of Israel right now. The world does not understand that. And the world hates it. And the world works against it. But it's true. And they're there. And they're going to stay there. Because God said so. Period. There are ways of thinking about Israel that are different from what we've been thinking. I hear too many Christians who are supporters of Israel wring their hands and worry about Israel disappearing. They're going to be destroyed. What are you talking about? It's a privilege to live in this time. And I want to say again, it's a privilege for me today to be here among Bible people, among friends who have the same worldview. So I thank you for your kind attention.